The envelope on her kitchen table contained enough money to keep her mother alive for 3 months, and all it cost was one evening pretending to love a man she had never met. Mara Ellison stood at the window of her apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and other people's cooking, and she looked at the city below the way people look at things they're slowly losing grip on. The lights were bright out there. They always were. The city didn't care that her checking account had hit a number that made her stomach fold in on itself every time she opened the banking app. It didn't care that the stack of papers on the counter, medical invoices, insurance denials, prescription receipts, had grown thick enough to use as a doorstop. It didn't care that she hadn't bought new shoes in 14 months, or that she'd been eating rice and whatever her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, left outside her door with a sympathetic smile and no questions. She was 31 years old, 4 months unemployed, sole caregiver to a mother whose kidneys were doing what her doctors described with careful clinical language that always meant the same thing: expensive, increasingly, urgently expensive. Mara had done everything right before the world stopped cooperating. She had a degree in international security studies from Georgetown. She had spent 6 years as a private sector analyst, reading threat assessments, advising on diplomatic risk, sitting in rooms with people who wore expensive watches and made decisions that moved money across continents. She was good at her job. She was precise, composed, and difficult to rattle, qualities her former employer had praised enthusiastically, right up until the firm restructured and eliminated her entire department with a Friday afternoon email and a severance package that lasted 2 months. Since then, she had applied for 61 positions. She had received 4 interviews and 0 offers. She had sold her car. She had transferred her savings twice and watched the number shrink both times. She had sat across from her mother in the small bedroom at the end of the hall and held her hand and told her everything was fine in a voice she had practiced until it almost sounded true. So when Daniel Cho, a contact from her old firm, a man she trusted the way you trust someone you've never needed to distrust, called her on a Tuesday evening and said he had something unusual to offer, she didn't hang up. "One night," he said, "a military reception at the Ritz-Carlton, high security, invitation only. You'd go as a companion." His companion. Whose companion? A pause. General Yoon Tae-jun. She knew the name. Everyone in her former field knew the name. Yoon Tae-jun was the Joint Commander of the U.S.-Korea Strategic Coordination Division, a position that sounded bureaucratic until you understood what it actually meant, which was that he sat at the intersection of 2 military establishments and held the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. He was 39, decorated 3 times, notoriously private. The kind of man whose name appeared in security briefings and never in gossip columns because the people who knew him understood there was nothing casual about him. "Why does a man like that need a paid companion for a reception?" she asked. "He doesn't need one," Daniel said carefully. "He needs a specific kind of presence, someone credible, someone who can hold a conversation with a 4-star admiral without flinching, someone who looks like she belongs there. And he's paying for it." He is. The number Daniel gave her was precise, not rounded, not inflated, precise. The way people give numbers when they've thought about what you actually need, rather than what would sound impressive. It was almost insulting how accurately it corresponded to 3 months of her mother's treatment protocol. Mara looked at the stack of papers on the counter. "One night," she said. "One night," he confirmed. She said yes before she finished the sentence. She told herself it was a transaction, clean, defined, professional. She was providing a service. He was compensating her for it. There was nothing to feel about that except practical. She told herself that right up until the black car arrived at her building at 6:15 on a Friday evening, and the man in the passenger seat handed her a small card with 4 words on it. He will explain everything. He did not explain everything, not explain. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom was the kind of space designed to make people feel small in a way that was supposed to feel like grandeur. Chandeliers that cost more than her apartment building, floors that reflected the light like shallow water. Uniformed staff who moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people trained to be unseen. Mara arrived alone, as instructed, and was escorted to a private anteroom off the main hall. She had worn the only dress she still owned that was appropriate for an event like this, a deep green that she'd bought 3 years ago for a company dinner and hadn't had occasion to wear since. She had done her own hair. She was aware, walking into that room, that she looked like someone who had made the best of what she had. She wasn't ashamed of it. She just noticed it. What she didn't expect was for the room to go quiet the moment the door at the far end opened. Not loudly quiet, not dramatically quiet. The conversations didn't stop. The glasses didn't freeze mid-air. It was subtler than that. A collective adjustment like a shift in atmospheric pressure. Backs straightened, eyes moved. 2 officers near the window stepped aside without being asked. General Yoon Tae-jun walked into the room the way men walk when they have never once wondered whether they belong somewhere. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from the photographs she'd seen in briefing documents, which always managed to make powerful people look manageable. In person, there was nothing manageable about him. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had trained himself out of every unnecessary gesture. Dark suit, no medal pins tonight. Deliberately civilian in presentation, she noted, which meant the evening had diplomatic implications he wasn't advertising. His jaw was set, his expression neutral in a way that wasn't blankness but control. There was a difference, and she registered it immediately. He found her in approximately 4 seconds. The eye contact was brief and thorough. He crossed the room without hurrying, stopped in front of her at a distance that was professional but not cold, and looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, like he was already calculating what it would cost him. "Miss Ellison," he said. His English was precise and unaccented, American-educated. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it. "General," she said, "you've been briefed." Minimally. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a reaction, more like the absence of the dismissal she suspected he'd been ready to deliver. "Then I'll be direct. Tonight is a joint reception for senior command staff from 3 allied nations. My presence here is political as much as it is professional. Having a companion suggests stability. It discourages certain assumptions." "About your availability," she said. "About my priorities." He glanced at her once more, the assessment clinical and unhurried. "You'll stay close. Respond naturally to conversation. You have a background in security analysis." Daniel confirmed this. "If someone asks, you may acknowledge it. Keep details vague." "And if someone asks how we met?" A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. "A mutual contact. We've known each other 6 months. Keep it simple." "Simple," she repeated. "Understood." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he offered his arm and she took it, and they walked out into the ballroom together like 2 people who had rehearsed something they both knew was fiction. The first hour was fine. Mara had spent years in rooms like this. She knew how to listen more than she spoke, how to ask questions that made powerful men feel interesting, how to move through a social landscape reading the invisible architecture of alliances and tensions that most people couldn't see. She was good at it. It had been her job once. Tae-jun was, she noticed, also good at it, in a completely different way. Where she worked through warmth and attentiveness, he worked through economy. He said less than anyone else in any given conversation, and somehow left every exchange having communicated exactly what he intended. She watched him redirect a 3-star general's pointed question about defense budget allocations with 6 words and a slight inclination of his head, and the general walked away looking satisfied. It was, professionally speaking, impressive. He didn't speak to her much during those first exchanges. She hadn't expected him to. She was set dressing, she reminded herself, a strategic prop. She smiled at the right moments and stood at the right angle and asked questions when it seemed useful, and that was the arrangement. What she noticed in the spaces between conversations was that he watched the room constantly, not anxiously. There was nothing anxious about him, systematically. His gaze moved through the space in a pattern that she recognized after 20 minutes as a trained security sweep, the kind of environmental monitoring that became unconscious after enough years. He was reading the room the same way she was. At one point their eyes met in the middle of one of those sweeps, and she realized they had both just clocked the same thing, A man near the east corridor who had been in 3 separate conversations in the last 40 minutes without appearing to belong to any of them. Moving, listening, positioning. Tae-jun looked back at the person he was speaking to without missing a beat. So did she. But she filed it away. His name, she learned later, was Conrad Voss, a consultant attached to one of the attending delegations, credentialed and cleared, unremarkable on paper. But Mara had spent 6 years learning that the most dangerous people in any room were always the ones whose paperwork was perfect. She tracked him quietly over the next 90 minutes. Not overtly, she was still doing everything she was there to do, standing beside Tae-jun, engaging with guests, performing the easy fiction of a relationship she didn't have. But part of her attention never left Voss. He was working toward someone on Tae-jun's team. That much became clear. He was building toward a specific conversation, creating proximity with the kind of patience that wasn't social. It was tactical. And the target, she was fairly certain, was Colonel Park, Tae-jun's aide-de-camp, who had been drinking more than was professionally advisable and was currently laughing too loudly near the bar. The thing about a room like this, full of important people with complicated relationships, was that a single compromising conversation, recorded, extracted, delivered to the right person at the right moment, could do more damage than most weapons. She knew that. She'd written assessments about exactly that kind of operation. She excused herself from Tae-jun's side quietly, citing the restroom, and moved across the room with the specific casualness of someone who wasn't going anywhere in particular. She reached Colonel Park 2 minutes before Voss did. She introduced herself as a mutual acquaintance of someone she was reasonably confident Park knew, a calculated risk that paid off when he nodded immediately and accepted her into conversation with the easy warmth of a man who'd had 3 glasses of wine. She kept him there. She was funny when she needed to be, and attentive when she needed to be, and she watched from the edge of her vision as Voss circled once, reassessed, and eventually moved on. She stayed with Park another 4 minutes. Then she excused herself and walked back across the room. Tae-jun was watching her when she returned. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had. He said nothing. She said nothing. She took her place beside him and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and that was all. At 11:15, they were escorted out through a side entrance into the quiet of a private corridor. The noise of the reception faded behind heavy doors. Staff had disappeared. It was just the 2 of them and the particular silence of a long evening coming to an end. Tae-jun walked beside her without speaking for a moment. His posture had shifted slightly. Not relaxed exactly, but no longer performing the particular stillness required in public rooms. "Park," he said finally. "He was a target," she said. "The consultant, Voss. He was building toward him all evening. Park had been drinking, and Voss had the kind of patience that suggested he'd done it before." Tae-jun was quiet for 3 seconds. "You redirected him." "I kept Park occupied long enough that the window closed." Another silence. She was aware of him looking at her in a way he hadn't looked at her all evening. Not the clinical initial assessment, not the strategic monitoring. Something more direct than either of those. "You weren't asked to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "Why did you?" She considered the question honestly. "Because I saw it and I could stop it, and that seemed like the obvious thing to do." He studied her face for a moment, then he looked forward again and his jaw tightened slightly, and he said nothing further until they reached the exit where the car was waiting. At the door she stopped. This was where it ended. One night, as agreed. She had done what she was asked to do, and more besides, and the money would be deposited by morning, and she would go home to her apartment and her stack of papers, and her mother's quiet breathing down the hall, and that would be the end of it. "Thank you," he said. It came out like something he'd had to locate deliberately, like a word in a language he didn't use often. She nodded once. "Good night, General." She walked to the car and didn't look back. She told herself she wouldn't think about him after tonight. She was wrong about that. 3 days later, her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers had been delivering bad news for 4 months, and she'd developed a Pavlovian reluctance. But she answered, because she always answered, because there was always the possibility that it was something important about her mother. "Ms. Ellison." The voice was immediate and unmistakable. She sat down on the edge of her bed. "General," she said, "I have a matter I need to discuss with you. Are you available this afternoon?" She looked around her apartment, at the kettle on the counter, at the medical folder on the table, at the pair of shoes by the door she'd been meaning to resolve for weeks. "I'm available," she said. He came to her. That surprised her. She had expected a car, an address, a glossy office somewhere in the kind of building that had its own security desk. Instead, he arrived at her door at 2 in the afternoon in plain clothes, dark trousers, a charcoal sweater, no visible markers of rank or status, with a folder under his arm and an expression that suggested he had thought carefully about what he was about to say. She let him in. She didn't apologize for the apartment. She poured 2 cups of coffee because it seemed like the right thing to do, and she set them on the kitchen table next to the medical folder she moved without comment, and she sat down across from him and waited. He looked around the apartment once. She watched him do it, the sweep of someone who reads spaces the way other people read faces. His eyes moved over the stack of papers, the sparse counter, the careful tidiness of someone who didn't have much but maintained what they had. He didn't comment. "What I'm about to propose is unusual," he said. "You came to my apartment on a Wednesday afternoon," she said. "I assumed it wouldn't be routine." The corner of his mouth moved, almost imperceptibly. She filed it away. "What you did Friday evening was not in the scope of what you were hired for. You identified a threat independently, assessed it correctly, and neutralized it without alerting the room or drawing attention to the risk. That kind of judgment is not common." "I had 6 years of practice," she said. "I know. I had your full background checked Saturday morning." He said it plainly, without apology. "Your record is exceptional. Your firm's restructuring was unrelated to your performance in any way." She kept her expression level. "Is there a point coming?" "There is." He opened the folder. Voss wasn't operating alone. What happened Friday was the opening move in something larger, an effort to compromise my command structure ahead of a joint review that carries significant geopolitical weight. My own team has been working to identify the network around him. They're good, but they have blind spots. He paused. "You don't appear to have the same blind spots. You want to hire me. I want to bring you on in a consulting capacity. Officially, you'd be attached to my office as a strategic advisor. Unofficially, you'd be helping me understand who in my immediate circle I can't fully trust." He placed a single page on the table between them. A contract, clean and brief. "The compensation is significant, the duration is flexible, and your background returns to full professional standing." Mara looked at the page, then at him. His expression gave nothing away, as expected, but she had been reading people for a long time, and she had learned that what people didn't show was often as informative as what they did. He was holding himself very still in the way people hold themselves still when the answer matters more than they want to admit. "You think I'll say yes because I need the money," she said. "I think you'll say yes because you're underemployed, and it's a problem worth solving." A pause. "The money is incidental. It's not incidental to me. I know that too." He said it without condescension. Just fact. She looked at the contract again. A part of her, the part that had been living in a defensive crouch for 4 months, managing everything alone, pretending to her mother that everything was fine, felt the particular vertigo of a door opening unexpectedly. She didn't trust it. She was practiced at not trusting it. "One condition," she said. He waited. "My schedule accommodates my mother's appointments. Non-negotiable. I don't miss them." Something passed across his face briefly, too briefly for her to name. "Agreed," he said, without exception. She picked up the pen he'd placed beside the folder. She signed. The next 4 weeks were not what she expected. She had anticipated a formal, distant arrangement. She would deliver reports. He would receive them. They would interact professionally and minimally. That was the nature of contracts with men like him, she assumed. Clean lines. No texture. What she got instead was access. He pulled her into briefings she had no technical obligation to attend. He forwarded her files at unusual hours, with brief notes that weren't instructions so much as invitations to weigh in. When she pushed back on his assessments, and she did twice in the first week alone, he didn't dismiss her. He went quiet for a moment, the way people go quiet when they're actually thinking rather than waiting for their turn to speak, and then he either updated his position or explained his reasoning in a way that made her understand it better. It was, professionally, the most engaged she had felt in years. She didn't examine that too closely. Her mother liked him, which Mara hadn't anticipated because he hadn't met her mother. But she mentioned him in passing one evening. His name. Something he'd said in a meeting that had struck her as unexpectedly precise, and her mother had tilted her head from the pillow with the particular alertness of a woman who had been reading her daughter for 31 years. "That's the first time you've talked about work in months," her mother said. "I've talked about work," Mara said. "You've talked about the situation, not the work. There's a difference." Mara handed her the evening medication and changed the subject. The first real conflict arrived in week 5. His name was Marcus Hale, a senior liaison officer on Tae-jun's Joint Command Staff, American, impeccably credentialed, universally liked in the way that people are liked when they work very hard at being liked. Mara had flagged him in her second week as someone worth watching. Not for anything concrete. It was pattern-based, the specific frequency with which he appeared in adjacency to sensitive exchanges without appearing to be the center of them. She brought it to Tae-jun on a Thursday morning. He was quiet for longer than usual. "Hale has been with this unit for 4 years, he said finally. "I understand that. He has clearance reviews that are clean, 3 separate reviews." "I know." She kept her voice even. "I'm not saying he's compromised. I'm saying the pattern is worth examination." "Based on what, specifically?" She laid it out. The timing, the positioning. The 3 instances where information had moved in directions that benefited Voss's network, in ways that were invisible unless you mapped them together. It was circumstantial. She knew it was circumstantial. But it was the kind of circumstantial that her instincts, sharpened over 6 years, wouldn't let her set down. Tae-jun listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood, walked to the window, and stood there for a long moment with his back to her. "I'll look at it," he said. It wasn't the answer she'd wanted. "Looking at it isn't—" "Mara." He said her name quietly, and something about the directness of it stopped her. He turned from the window. "I hear you, I will look at it. Give me time to do that without pulling the thread in a way that alerts him if you're right." She recognized the logic. She didn't like being managed, but she recognized the logic. "Fine," she said. "But if I see something move in the next 2 weeks, you'll tell me immediately." His eyes were steady on hers. "I'm not dismissing this." She nodded once. She left. She spent the drive home telling herself that the way he'd said her name meant nothing. 3 days later, she arrived at the office to find the energy in the building entirely altered. Staff moved with the brisk, slightly too controlled manner of people who had received significant information and were managing it. Tae-jun's door was closed. Colonel Park stood outside it, with the particular expression of a man stationed at a door precisely because he doesn't want anyone to knock. "What happened?" she asked. Park looked at her with something she couldn't quite read. "The general will brief you." She waited 40 minutes. Then the door opened and Tae-jun stood in it. And he looked at her in a way that made her understand something had shifted. "You were right about Hale," he said. The confirmation landed quietly. She had been right about things before. It had never felt quite like this. "How bad?" she asked. "Manageable. Now." The emphasis was clean and deliberate, now because of what she'd flagged. He stepped back from the door. "Come in." She went in. He briefed her fully for the first time. Not edited summaries, not the version filtered through what she needed to know. Everything. The full scope of what Voss's network had been building toward, what Hale had been feeding them, what would have been compromised at the joint review in 6 weeks if none of it had been caught. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "You flagged him in week 2, Tae-jun said. "Yes." "I should have moved faster." She looked at him. It was such a specific thing for a man like him to say. Direct, unqualified, no deflection. She filed it away next to everything else she'd been filing and trying not to examine. "You moved in time," she said. "That's what matters." He held her gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he looked down at the desk, adjusted a folder that didn't need adjusting, and said, "Thank you." "You keep thanking me," she said. "You keep earning it." She left before she could think too clearly about the way that had landed. The second conflict was less professional and more complicated. It started at a dinner she hadn't expected to be invited to, a small gathering of senior staff and their partners at the residence of Admiral Fletcher, Tae-jun's American counterpart. Tae-jun had mentioned it the day before in passing, which she had taken as information, not an invitation. Then she received a car at 7 o'clock and a note that said presents would be useful. She wore the green dress again. It was still the only appropriate option she owned. He met her at the door. He looked at the dress briefly, a single look, immediate and redirected, and said nothing except, "Admiral Fletcher talks more than he listens. You'll find it useful." "I'll try to contain my excitement," she said, the almost smile again. She was starting to catalogue them. The evening was fine until the woman arrived. Her name was Sophia Lund, Swedish, impeccably dressed, the kind of beautiful that announced itself without effort. She was the former partner of someone on the general staff, which explained the invitation, and she had the specific familiarity with Tae-jun's orbit that suggested history. Not current history, the kind that had ended but hadn't fully resolved, the kind that left a specific texture in a room. Mara noticed Tae-jun's posture shift when Sophia entered. Fractional, controllable, but there. She noticed Sophia glance at Tae-jun, then at Mara, and then arrange her expression into something gracious and faintly assessing. She noticed herself noticing all of this and found it deeply inconvenient. The dinner was 12 people. She was seated 4 chairs from Tae-jun, which meant she spent the meal watching him navigate a conversation with Sophia that appeared effortless from the outside and was, she suspected, costing him something. Sophia was warm with him in a way that knew him. She referenced things he clearly understood. At one point she said something quietly that made him look down at his plate for a moment before he responded. Mara engaged brilliantly with the Admiral on her right and felt absolutely nothing about any of it. After dinner in the drawing room, Sophia found her. "You're the new advisor," she said. It was friendly. It was also not just friendly. "I am," Mara said. "He doesn't usually bring advisors to personal dinners." "I wasn't aware this was personal." She kept her tone easy, curious rather than defensive. "I was told it would be useful." Sophia looked at her for a moment with something that was too complicated to be simple curiosity. "He said that?" "He did?" A beat. Sophia's smile softened into something more genuine. "Then it probably is," she said, and moved away. Mara spent the next 20 minutes near the window with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, going through everything she knew about emotional compartmentalization, and arriving at the unwelcome conclusion that she was significantly worse at it than she'd believed. On the drive home, separate cars, she'd insisted, she sat in the back and stared at the city going past, and had a frank internal conversation with herself about the difference between professional investment and personal investment, and the precise point at which she had crossed from one to the other without noticing. She did not arrive at a comfortable conclusion. The next morning she was 15 minutes early, which was unusual. He was already there, which was not. He was at the window with a coffee, not looking at anything in particular. He turned when she came in, and something moved through his expression quickly, something that might have been relief if it had been anyone else. "Sophia," she said because she was tired of going around things, "you two have history." He was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago. It ended because the position demanded a great deal, and I gave it accordingly. Does she know it's over? Yes, no hesitation. We both know it. She nodded. She moved toward the desk. He was still watching her. "Mara." She stopped. "Why are you asking?" She turned and looked at him across the room. He was still by the window with the light behind him, and his expression was as controlled as always, but there was something in his eyes that was neither clinical nor strategic, something that had no professional category that she could find. "Professional due diligence," she said. The muscle in his jaw moved. He knew she was lying. She knew he knew. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Of course," he said finally, and turned back to the window. She sat down at the desk and opened her laptop, and did not look up for several minutes. The room felt significantly different than it had the day before. Week 8 brought the crisis that changed everything. It arrived at 6 in the morning in the form of a phone call. Park's voice, compressed and careful, delivering information in the way people deliver information they wish they didn't have to deliver. Someone had leaked. Not Hale. Hale had been removed cleanly, quietly, no public trace. Someone else, further in than they'd understood. A document pertaining to the joint review had surfaced in a place it shouldn't exist. And it had surfaced attached to Tae-jun's name in a way that suggested he had been the source. He hadn't been. She knew that with complete certainty. But certainty didn't matter yet. What mattered was that in 48 hours, the Joint Review Committee would convene, and if the document was authenticated before that, his command was gone. She was at the office in 30 minutes. She found him standing in the middle of the room, not at the window, not at the desk, just standing, as if he'd stopped mid-thought and not yet decided what came next. He was in yesterday's suit, which meant he hadn't been home. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to her when she came in and stayed there. "Tell me what you have," she said. He told her. She pulled her chair to his desk without being invited, opened her laptop and started working. She worked for 11 hours with 2 breaks, one for coffee, one for her mother's morning call, which she took in the hallway and kept under 4 minutes. He worked beside her and across from her, and occasionally behind her, looking over her shoulder at her screen. And at some point during the afternoon, she stopped noticing his proximity in the way she'd been noticing it for weeks, and simply worked, because the problem was real and solvable, and she was the person in this room who could solve it. The document had been designed to look internal, formatting, metadata, language that mirrored Tae-jun's actual communication style, closely enough to survive a casual review, but not a careful one. She found the seam at hour 7, a timestamp discrepancy that was invisible in the document's native format, but surfaced when she ran it through a secondary authentication process she'd used in her old firm for exactly this kind of forensic work. "There," she said. He leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen. He was close enough that she could feel the presence of him, the warmth, the particular steadiness of someone who had been trained to be still under pressure. She focused on the screen. "The timestamp is wrong," she said, "by 14 minutes. Whoever built this used a template from an older version of your internal system, pre-upgrade. Anyone who knows when the upgrade happened will see it immediately." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Park knows when it happened. Get Park." Park knew. Park could confirm it. The authentication process took 3 hours to formalize, and she stayed for all 3, and by 9 in the evening, they had a documented case that cleared Tae-jun's name before the committee's morning session. He sent her home at 9:30 with the kind of directive that wasn't quite an order, but wasn't quite a request either. She went because she was exhausted in a way that had settled into her bones. She was in the elevator when her phone buzzed. A message from him. 3 words. "Thank you. Rest." She stood in the elevator and looked at those 3 words for a long moment. Then she put her phone in her bag and stared at the elevator door and took a slow breath that didn't do as much as she needed it to. He came to her door that night. She didn't hear it the first time. She was in with her mother, helping with the evening medication, having the quiet routine conversation about small things that had become the architecture of their evenings together. Her mother was having a better week, which meant she was alert and wry and had noticed with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years reading people that her daughter was carrying something she wasn't talking about. "You look like you solved a problem and found a bigger one," her mother said. "I solved a problem," Mara said. And nothing. Go to sleep." Her mother made the face she made when she was cataloguing something for later, and Mara kissed her forehead and turned off the bedside lamp. She almost missed the knock. She opened the door and found Tae-jun standing in the hallway of her building in a dark coat, his hands at his sides. He was not in uniform. He had not called. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like someone who had arrived somewhere without having planned to. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "I didn't thank you correctly," he said. "You sent 3 words, and they were sufficient." He looked at her steadily. "I sent 3 words because I didn't trust what I would have said with more." The hallway was quiet. Somewhere below them a door closed. The building settled. "Tae-jun," she said. He looked at her when she used his name, just his name without the title, and something in his face changed in the way things change when people have been waiting for something they weren't sure would come. "I don't do this," he said. It wasn't an explanation, it was an admission. "I don't stand in hallways, I don't... whatever this is." A pause. "I don't know what I'm doing here." "I think you know exactly what you're doing here," she said quietly. The words sat between them for a moment. "The contract," he said. "I want to change it." She waited. "Not the work." "The work stays." He held her gaze. Something in him was very still. Not controlled still, not managed still, but the stillness of someone who had made a decision and was standing behind it. "I want the rest to be real. I understand if that isn't—" "It already is," she said. He stopped. She watched him take that in, watched the thing he carried so carefully shift, just slightly, like something that had been held at a particular angle for too long finally resting into its natural position. He stepped forward. She didn't step back. He lifted his hand and touched the side of her face with the kind of care that had nothing transactional about it, nothing strategic, nothing held in reserve. She felt the full weight of it, of him, of all those weeks of calibrated distance finally resolving into something honest. When he kissed her, it was unhurried and steady, and exactly like someone who had been thinking about it for longer than either of them would have admitted to. She pressed closer, feeling the warmth of him, and thought with the clear, uncomplicated certainty that arrives when something stops being a question. Yes, this. They stood in the hallway for a long time. The joint review convened without incident. The documentation she'd built held. The committee cleared Tae-jun's record formally on record, with a thoroughness that was partly bureaucratic and partly, she suspected, a recognition of how close it had come. Voss's network was quietly unwound over the following weeks by people with better investigative infrastructure than hers, and considerably less elegance. Marcus Hale resigned. No charges were ever publicly filed, which was how things worked at that level. In that world, she had made her peace with how things worked at that level. Her mother's doctor called in the 4th month with numbers that were, for the first time in 2 years, moving in the right direction. She got the call at the office. She sat for a moment at her desk after she hung up, looking at the wall, feeling something in her chest expand in a way that had no professional category either. Tae-jun came in from a meeting, registered her expression and stopped. "Good news," she said. Her voice came out unsteady in a way she didn't try to fix. He crossed to her without a word. He sat on the edge of the desk and he didn't say anything, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her and they stayed like that in the quiet office for a long moment, the city visible through the window, the afternoon light coming through at the angle it came through in late fall, warm and low. "The contract," she said finally. "The original consulting contract expired 3 weeks ago," he said. "I renewed it without discussing it with you, which I should address." She pulled back slightly to look at him. "You renewed it without telling me?" "I intended to discuss it. Then I became preoccupied." His expression was composed, but his eyes weren't. They had that quality she'd learned over months, the quality that meant he was choosing his words, because the real ones were close to the surface, and he wasn't yet sure what to do with them. "I have a proposal," he said. "I've heard your proposals before. This one is different." He held her gaze. "No terms, no timeline, no contingencies." A pause. "Just this. However long this is. However it goes." She looked at him, this precise, controlled, unexpectedly careful man who had shown up at her door without planning to, and kissed her in a hallway, and never once made her feel like a transaction again, after the moment he'd realized she wasn't one. "You're terrible at this," she said. "I'm aware. That was not a structured proposal." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She took his hand. He looked down at their hands, then back at her. and something in his face did the thing she had learned to watch for. That small, real, unguarded thing that only happened when he wasn't trying to prevent it. "Yes," she said simply. He didn't say anything. He brought her hand up and held it. And that was enough. More than enough. And outside the window, the city went on being bright and indifferent, and neither of them needed it to care. She had taken the envelope to save her mother's life, and expected nothing from the man on the other side of it, except professional distance and a check. She had not expected to find, in the most carefully armored person she had ever met, someone who showed up at her door without knowing why, and stood in the light and told the truth when it cost him. The contract was gone. What replaced it had no expiration date, no fine print, no clause that allowed for early termination. She hadn't planned any of it. Neither had he. That, she had come to understand, was precisely why it was real.